A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, the Prime Minister's leadership is under fire over the proposed overhaul of our hate speech and gun laws. Over the weekend, Anthony Albanese confirmed the Coalition and Greens would not support key elements of the government's legislation. So, was the legislation rushed? Are concerns over freedom of speech valid? And what does this latest setback mean for our Prime Minister, who is under so much pressure? Those details in just a moment. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Monday, the 19th of January. An emotional tribute for the victims of the Bondi Terror attack in Parliament as politicians were recalled early to debate the government's proposed hate speech and gun legislation. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese speaking first and introducing a condolence motion naming the 15 innocent people killed.
We make it clear to every Jewish Australian, you are not alone. All Australians stand with you. Australians were with you at Bondi Beach in those unspeakable minutes of violence and terror. Police officers and first responders running towards danger to save lives, backed by Hatzalah and community health support. Adults shielding children they did not know from bullets. Lifeguards using their boards as stretchers to carry the wounded. Cafe staff giving shelter to people fleeing in fear. And passers-by performing acts of extraordinary bravery.
Meantime, Jewish Labor MP Josh Burns also mourned the many lives lost and also the many injured.
We must not dehumanise each other because dehumanisation is what leads to exactly what happened in Bondi. Not every act of hate ends in violence, but every act of violence begins with hate.
Local MP Allegra Spender, who was at Bondi Beach with her family just an hour before the mass shooting, also spoke of how the horror that unfolded that day will be felt for many years to come.
Sunday, December 14, is one of the darkest days in modern Australia. One part of our community, Jewish Australians, were murderously targeted. It was an attack on them and an attack on our Australian values. Our country will never be the same, nor should it be. The question is who we become now, how we honour the memories of the 15 beautiful people we lost, how we honour and care for the dozens who are physically injured and the countless who can never forget the trauma and the bloodshed of the day, and the families who will live with the scars forever.
Politicians are continuing to pay tribute in Parliament ahead of tomorrow's debate. Overseas now, where at least 21 people have been killed and many more injured after two high-speed trains crashed in Spain. Local media is reporting at least 100 others were injured, more than 25 seriously. It's believed one of the trains derailed and crossed onto another track, colliding with another oncoming train. Hundreds of passengers were on board. It's not yet known why one of the trains derailed, with investigations now underway. And Sydney's DY Beach has been closed after another shark attack. An 11-year-old was paddling on his surfboard when he was hit several times. The boy managed to escape injury and fled to the shore. Local media have published photos of the surfboard with a number of bite marks. It comes just a day after a 12-year-old was critically injured in a shark attack near Vaucluse in Sydney's east. He was swimming in the water with friends when a large bull shark mauled both his legs. He's now fighting for life in hospital. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with Crikey's political editor Bernard Keane on the federal government's proposed overhaul of hate speech and gun laws. The legislation is set to be debated in Parliament tomorrow, but the major changes have already been met with widespread concerns. Bernard, thanks so much for joining us. We know that Parliament has been recalled to debate this legislation. Then over the weekend, it's being seen as a back down, or one may argue a compromise from the Prime Minister, saying he will now split this legislation. It doesn't seem he has support for this proposed overhaul of hate speech laws in this country. Have you seen anything like this in your career? You've been covering and watching politics for 40 years or more?
Yeah, I think we've reached a level of dysfunction that's pretty disheartening, and on a really crucial issue. I mean, If we go back a decade, the Abbott government had a really big debate about 18C, Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, a big debate over free speech. And they copped a lot of grief at the time, and some of that was warranted. But to give them credit, at least they had a debate and they worked through it properly, a proposal to significantly pull back on the current sort of hate speech framework, which is mainly about like civil issues, not about criminal issues, which this law or this bill deals with. But they did it properly. They did a proper process. This process, and you can talk about all the demands from the opposition, to bring back Parliament before Christmas and et cetera, and all completely fair enough. But the rush nature of these laws is really quite remarkable. And the government has rightly, ended up having to back down and withdraw the most contentious part of the law, which is a big overhaul of our hate speech laws to introduce a range of criminal penalties for stuff that is obviously A, not currently covered by Commonwealth law, but B, really raises some pretty significant questions about the whole issue of how you interact, or how you combine people's right in a democracy to say what they want within limits versus people's right to feel safe. That's a really complicated issue, and no country deals with it easily. Little shout out to the bureaucrats who had to sit and draft that over, Christmas break. Laws that are immensely difficult to get right, even before you then hand them to the federal police, who then have to implement. There's always this question, not merely of what are the laws saying in black and white, but how do the police interpret them? How do the prosecutors interpret them? How do judges interpret them? That's all down the track. So there's no risk of us getting these laws right, judging by the current process, and it's on a really fundamental issue. And there's basically no one left who supports that particular element of the bill, just dealing with criminal hate speech.
So were the concerns valid, Bernard, in raising concerns about this specific part of the legislation, and would have they been draconian? The concerns were justified, do you believe, especially because it was rushed?
I think so. I think there's look, full disclosure, I've been writing about free speech for, as long as I've been the job at Crikey, so nearly 2 decades. And in that time, I have stuck up, rightly or wrongly, for some people that I, pretty strongly disagree with. So I come from a very pro free speech kind of background. I accept that there is a need for society to regulate free speech. And the main areas that you've got to regulate it around are issues to do with race and religion and sexuality. There are a lot of expressions of legitimate concern about the fact that there were some things in this bill that some people thought should be there. That is, the laws don't go far enough. So LGBTIQ plus groups said, you've got religion, where's sexuality? And once you inject religion into this, it just makes it so much more complicated, because the main attacks on religion in Australia, and I suspect around most of the world, they don't come from atheists. They come from other religions. So the moment that you start saying, well, we've got to protect religions, that means you're going to be protecting them from other religions and how those religions express themselves. And, that's taken the form of this weird exemption in the bill, in the section of the bill that's now being withdrawn, that said it was okay if you're quoting from a sacred text. So you go and quote the terrible things that the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Quran say about, Jews and Christians and Muslims. All sorts of terrible stuff can be found in those texts, but it was okay to quote them. That sums up the fact that if you want to protect religion, you're probably going to be constricting someone else's religion in order to do that, and that makes the task, even harder.
So, Bernard, one may ask, a lot of critics are asking right now, this is a real test of Anthony Albanese's leadership. Would this have not been an opportunity for the Prime Minister and, of course, the opposition leader and the Greens to all get in a room and say, okay, we need to do something, we want to get it right, and negotiate there before putting it to Parliament for debate? Because debate is a fundamental of a democratic society.
Yeah, I think there's been a structural failure, if I can use that term, in our major parties, but from both sides. I mean, the rush to politicise the Bondi atrocity from the coalition, I thought was pretty staggering. But Anthony Albanese's failure, and I think it was a serious failure, to offer leadership after that was as culpable. I mean, I criticised very quickly his decision not to hold a Royal Commission. Commissioning the Richardson Review, I just don't think was ever going to be enough. So he should have gone further. Honestly, I thought that was a no-brainer. At no stage, I think, has Anthony Albanese looked like the kind of leader who could inspire us to come together. And, there's a lot of people of bad faith out there, and there's quite a few of them in the media. But I think the country was looking for some sort of unity in the wake of what happened, and Anthony Albanese, for a variety of reasons, wasn't able to provide that.
Bernard, we know the government put forward this proposed overhaul of legislation with both hate speech and also gun laws to stop a terror attack like what happened at Bondi from ever happening again in Australia. Exactly what happens with the legislation now after this latest overhaul?
So there's still the elements of the bill that are still on foot basically are the gun laws, one, immigration ones, and a section to deal with hate groups, which it was strongly linked to the hate speech section that's no longer there. But the gun laws section, I suspect, is going to pass, probably pass with the support of the Greens. There'll be a split in the coalition maybe over that. The section on migration, everyone's probably going to be happy with that except the Greens. Because it strengthens the government's powers to kick people out and stop people coming in. And that's been the broad direction of Australian migration policy now for many decades. On the hate group section, I think there is still a lot of concern about this. Basically, what's proposed in the bill is that the Home Affairs Minister would have the power to, if he gets a report or she gets a report from the head of ASIO about a particular group, he can simply make membership of that group a criminal offence. He's got to, or she's got to tell the Attorney General, and they've got to give a brief to the opposition leader. And they've got to do a little statement for Parliament. But that's it. There's no appeal from that decision. You can't take that decision to court and say there was no due process or there was no one consulted with us and blah blah. You can't do that. Now, this is of a piece with Labor likes that kind of legislation. That was at the heart of its environmental legislation as well. It wanted this ministerial power to just override everything in the Environmental Act, so it could push through projects if it decided it wanted, without any right of appeal, without any visibility. So this was a real Labor play, a real sort of Labor technique. And I think we should be really strongly concerned about it. Everyone's talking about the neo-Nazis and radical Islamic groups, and no one's carrying any water for them. No one's going to support them, but that power can potentially be used against any sort of group that, if ASIO decides that there's some sort of threat, or there's a political decision made that a particular group poses some sort of threat. So it's a power that's ripe for abuse, and I think there needs to be, it's a threshold kind of legislation, because what it basically says is you can be prosecuted not for something you've done, not for something you've said under the hate speech laws, but for being a member of a group, which really does take us back to, trying to ban the Communist Party. And it's a very unusual, I agree with Matt Canavan, but he's quite correct that this is the biggest sort of step since Menzies tried to ban the Communist Party. So I think there are a lot of concerns about that in terms of our civil liberties per se, not just free speech.
Bernard, there was an interview done with the ABC by the parents of little Matilda. We know that 10-year-old was killed in the Bondi Terror attack. Her parents have said that they're concerned the proposed overhaul of current legislation actually won't stop another terror attack. And I'm quoting her parents here. They've told the ABC, quote, "These laws are rarely for protection. They are usually to control law-abiding people and not the criminals, because criminals do not care about any laws you make about speech or any guns. They will find their way." So basically they're concerned that any of these proposed changes actually won't stop another terror attack.
I fully agree with them. My concern, and this is why right from the get-go, I thought a Royal Commission was the way to go, because we need someone to really be looking hard at the role of our security agencies in this. And look, they've got a tremendously difficult role. And, I'm sure they have stopped many terrorist attacks. I think there is evidence they have succeeded, but every failure puts them up in lights. And there is a recurring issue in Australia, which is that we have terror attacks that are carried out by people who are known to security agencies. And this one was no different. And this one was even more complex because of the fact that the alleged perpetrators, travelled to an area of the Philippines known to be linked to Islamic State, and one of them had amassed an arsenal. So, I think there are really serious questions to ask, obviously about the gun laws, which, the government is moving to address, but also about how our security agencies, whether it's ASIO and the AFP at the federal level or the New South Wales Police, how they worked, did their jobs, the basis on which they make their assessments. And what are our expectations about them? Are our expectations that they monitor everyone who's cropped up on their radar at some point, forever after? Or do they go, look, we've assessed this person, they're okay, let them go on their way. And, we don't hear from them again until, tragically, they emerge again to commit violence. Those issues all need to be explored because that's the only way we are going to stop malignant actors. Hate speech laws are not going to stop people who decide that Islamic State's the way to go and we need to kill people. All people who are, who self-radicalise or who have mental health issues, and this is a recurring issue again with terrorism perpetrators. The issues that we're grappling with in the government's bill are ones that are about the level of discourse in society, the general immigration parameter settings, and maybe prescribing some neo-Nazis and some militant Muslim fundamentalists. What do you do about people who are deeply malignant actors or who have mental health issues, who self-radicalise and decide that it's time to start killing people? It's an extraordinarily difficult challenge, and I don't think, and our security agencies have said, this is really difficult. This is our biggest concern. These, lone actors who almost out of nowhere emerge to start committing atrocities. But the problem is, they do seem to come across the radar of agencies, and we lack the ability to either detect them or stop them. And I think we've really got to explore that because it's, we're not in new territory here. The Bondi atrocity was, that had the most casualties of a terror event in Australia, but we've had a long succession of terror events now. And we can see the kinds of patterns that are emerging. And I think the role of our security agencies has really got to be interrogated if we're to hope that, they can improve their performance still further and, we don't see these sorts of further events. No one can guarantee we're never going to see terror events ever again because the sheer impossibility of stopping particularly lone wolf attacks, is so great. But I think there are big questions to be asked about how security agencies do their job and whether they are fitting our expectations and whether they've got enough money to do it, whether they have the powers to do it. I suspect they've got plenty of powers and plenty of money because those have been increased massively over the last 2 decades.
We really appreciate your time and analysis as always. Thanks, Bernard.
That's been my pleasure. Thanks.
That was Crikey's political editor, Bernard Keane. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning with a deep dive on the rise of One Nation and whether Pauline Hanson could be Prime Minister. And we'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.